So I wanted to do a chapter 2 review, and instead of doing the group Zoom discussion, I just decided to do just a quick video, just with kind of paraphrasing some of what C.S. Lewis says in chapter 2 in my own words to kind of help everyone as you continue to venture through the book. And then we will have another Zoom discussion after we finish chapter 3. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so for chapter 2, one of the things you'll notice at the very beginning of chapter 2 is that C.S. Lewis opens with a quote from Confucius, and the full quote is in his appendix, in the appendix of the book Abolition of Man. But here's the quote on the screen. In the beginning of chapter 2, he just says a little segment of this, but Confucius wrote, quote, "It is upon the trunk that a gentleman works. When that is firmly set up, the way grows. And surely proper behavior to parents and elder brothers is the trunk of goodness," end quote. And we can see that this quote is significant for several reasons, but one is because C.S. Lewis, many people think, is using this to demonstrate that there is a universal awareness of goodness and how goodness to a degree can be known by reason. That you have someone like Confucius, who's not a Christian, who just used his intellect, his reason, to be able to come to the recognition that there are certain behaviors that are good and proper, such as respecting your parents and your elders. And then even Confucius can see that there is this trunk, something that needs to be firmly rooted so that the person can grow into fulfillment and so the person can flourish. And so even Confucius sees this. And, these objective moral truths that are recognized not only by Christians, but by, those like Confucius and his followers and other non-Christian religious traditions also recognize there are some objective moral truths, and these are universal. And as such, they're not promoted only by Christians. So sometimes people will say, oh, these objective moral truths, this is just a way that Christians oppress us. Or this claims there is this God who tells us right and wrong as a way to not allow us to do what we want, to keep us enslaved, with these oppressive moral truths. And so C.S. Lewis opens up this chapter with this quote from Confucius to say, no, there are these universal objective truths that can be known by reason, demonstrated here with Confucius. And then the existence of this universal awareness of objective morality points to the fact that because of what the universe is and the type of creatures that we are, there is a proper way to act in order for us to do good and to flourish. So for human perfection, for human flourishing, for us to achieve the good, there is a proper behavior, there's a right way to act, and that this is not only a Christian belief. And in the appendix of this book, Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis will expand on this to demonstrate, what he does in the appendix is list quite a number of objective moral truths that are held by people of various backgrounds, both Christian, non-Christian, such as Jewish people, Hindus, Confucius, and others, to again, just demonstrate that because of who we are, the type of creatures that we are, there are things that are objectively good and true and beautiful. The way the universe is, there are things that are objectively true. But then Lewis, in the beginning of this chapter 2, points out that this philosophy being taught by the Green Book, this idea of subjectivism, it will destroy society. C.S. Lewis sees that this is a very destructive worldview, a very destructive approach to the way the world is, because it's not recognizing reality. It's this illusory way of viewing the world, and it's destructive. And so C.S. Lewis says that he believes it is true that this subjectivism, the Green Book philosophy is destructive, he says, but the fact that he believes it's destructive does not alone by itself refute the worldview of subjectivism. So we can't just, C.S. Lewis says, I can't just say, I think this worldview is destructive. I think it is, but I can't merely say that. It's not an adequate refutation. I need to present some arguments against this worldview, and that's what he'll proceed to do. And then he also mentions at the beginning of chapter 2 that we have to recognize that simply because someone may be willing to die for their belief does not therefore make it true. So you have to have more solid, more substantial reasons to argue for your point and against another point. And that's what he'll attempt to do. And so C.S. Lewis says that while he does believe that subjectivism is destructive, there are also theoretical difficulties in this philosophy that's promoted by the Green Book. And I'm going to put the page numbers at the top. This is in my particular version, and it's probably similar in yours. It may not be exactly the same, but it at least gives you an idea of where to look for where I am in the book. So chapter 2 still the first page or two of that. So Lewis is going to point out at the very beginning of chapter 2, one of his arguments against the philosophy that's presented in the Green Book by Gaius and Titius. So I'm going to say G and T from here on out, but the authors of the Green Book, he's going to point out they have committed a logical fallacy. And C.S. Lewis does express this. He doesn't tell you that it's the self-refuting argument. C.S. Lewis just tells you what he says, or what G and T say. So first, let me tell you what the self-refuting argument is. So there is a logical fallacy that's called the self-refuting argument. So for example, if I say there are no absolute truths, well, this is a self-refuting argument, because in this statement, I am claiming that it's absolutely true that there are no absolute truths, and that'd be contradictory. So it's a self-refuting argument. If I said there are no statements of fact, since truth is subjective, that would also be a self-refuting argument. It's contradictory because I'm saying there is no truth, yet my statement saying there are no statements of fact, since truth is subjective, is claiming a fact, is trying to claim that this one sentence is true. And so that's an example of a self-refuting argument. Well, G and T, are the authors of the book, of the Green Book, are wanting readers to hold that statements of value such as X is good are merely subjective and not objective. So essentially, they might say, if I hold that honesty is good, or if I hold an object is beautiful, it's merely my personal preference. It's not there's nothing objective about honesty or about the object that's objectively good or beautiful. Yet, C.S. Lewis is going to say that the authors, G and T, the authors of the Green Book, they wrote the book for a reason. And this reason was to persuade people that subjectivism is true, and to persuade people that subjectivism is the proper worldview. So they're making this claim that subjectivism, which kind of claims that there are no, things that are objectively universally true and good and beautiful, they're saying subjectivism is true and it's good, it's the proper worldview. And so they present this book as an objective truth, and they present it in such a way that they want their readers to agree with it. And C.S. Lewis says that if this was not the case, if they did not hold that subjectivism was the proper worldview, that it was the right view to hold, that it was the correct view to hold, then why promote this philosophy in their book without promoting other acceptable worldviews? The Green Book really just does prevent subjectivism as true. It doesn't lend its readers to say, oh, here are various worldviews to consider: subjectivism, or objective morality, or any of the other worldviews that exist. It's strictly promoting subjectivism. And so C.S. Lewis says that this presentation of the book is essentially a self-refuting argument to hold that if G and T say that if I hold honesty is good, for example, or that honesty is a true value that we should all agree on, they would say, well, that's your personal opinion. Subjectivist would say that's your personal opinion, your personal preference. Well, isn't it similar if I say that subjectivism is the true worldview, it's the proper worldview, it's the correct worldview? So subjectivism says that everything's merely personal opinion, personal preference, yet they're making a claim in the book that that's contradictory to this, saying subjectivism is true. So hopefully I explained that well, but that's, I think, what C.S. Lewis is getting at in this first part of chapter 2, is that he believes that G and T in the Green Book are making a self-refuting argument. And so C.S. Lewis will then continue in the chapter saying that even if someone were to say, you know, subjectivism is, even if G and T refrain in the book from ever saying subjectivism is good, this suggestion that subjectivism is necessary is simply a way of masking the same, masking what they believe, that subjectivism is the true and correct position. So even if the authors of the Green Book, G and T, never come out and say subjectivism is good and it's the only worldview, it's the right worldview, essentially they are trying to promote that subjectivism is the necessary approach to the world, which C.S. Lewis believes is a mask. They're just not coming out saying it's good and true and correct, but that's what they mean. And then C.S. Lewis kind of goes on to say that if asked, G and T would have to admit that they do not hold subjectivism as merely good because it's an emotional preference, but that they think it's good for its own sake, that it's good for society, that is the proper view of reality. This is what C.S. Lewis believes. He believes that if you come out and ask subjectivists, particularly the authors of the Green Book, you know, isn't subjectivism just your own opinion? Isn't it just your personal preference? That he believes the authors of the book would have to say that subjectivism is good for its own sake, it's good for society, it's good, it's the proper view of reality. Otherwise, why would they be promoting it like they are in this book with no presentation of any other acceptable worldviews or any other options for approaching reality? And so C.S. Lewis essentially is saying that, so this shows that the authors of the book would be admitting that there is an objective dimension in reality, a dimension that they're trying to deny in the book. So they would have to say that, yes, I believe subjectivism is good for society and the proper view of reality. And so by saying that, aren't they admitting to that there is something objectively true, an objective dimension, that it's this subjective approach is the only good way? And so C.S. Lewis believes that we can essentially point out to the authors of the Green Book that they're making a self-refuting argument saying there are no objective truths, yet they're making the claim that subjectivism is good and that it is true. And that they want the readers of the book to adopt the view of subjectivism. So that's one argument C.S. Lewis makes to try to counter this presentation of subjectivism. And then Lewis points out that once we recognize the self-refuting argument that G and T are making in this book, then we'll see that their claim that values are subjective and not objective is merely superficial. And so in the book, C.S. Lewis writes, quote, "Their skepticism about values is on the surface." So they're just trying to say that values are personal opinions and mere preferences. But if you dig deeper into the view of the authors of the Green Book, you'll see that they do hold subjectivism is good and true and proper, the right approach to reality. And so C.S. Lewis is going to point out that what G and T are doing in this book are promoting that their values and that their worldview is the proper one that should be accepted by readers, and that their idea, G and T's idea in the Green Book, that values should be seen as merely the result of emotion and personal preferences, seems to apply only to other people's values. So G and T hold subjectivism is true. My view is right. Your view of objectivism is wrong. You know, your view that certain moral truths are objectively universally true is your opinion, your personal preference. But my view as the author of the Green Book is not just a personal preference. It's not just emotional. It is true. And so C.S. Lewis is saying that it seems like their argument really is applying only to other people, and they're while they're upholding their own view, almost kind of like sometimes we say sometimes people today who get upset with Christians because we might hold that certain things are wrong. So like, let's say we might say that sex outside of marriage is always wrong. So some people today would be like, well, that's your opinion. The authors of the Green Book probably might even say, well, that's your opinion. That's your personal preference. You need to be, if you don't let me have my own view, which is that I think sex outside of marriage is okay, then you're intolerant. And so again, if I'm pretend the authors of the Green Book by saying that this Christian promotion that sex outside of marriage is always wrong, my view as the Green Book authors would be like, well, your view is merely opinion and personal preference. My view that it's okay trumps your view. We should let people believe whatever they want. Well, if we can let people believe whatever they want, then why are they giving us Christians a hard time for believing that there is a moral truth that's absolute, that's objective and universal? Hopefully that makes sense. I might be rambling a little bit, but I'm just trying to show how C.S. Lewis is trying to point out that the authors of the Green Book make a self-refuting argument, number one, and then number two, they criticize other people's views as being based on emotion and personal preference, but they don't apply that to their own views and to their own values. They hold their own values to be what people should accept. And so Lewis is going to say that many people who reject traditional values, the universal objective moral truth, these traditional values, they are going to hold their own objective values in the background. And they believe that they're somehow above being debunked. And so they believe that somehow they're above criticism, that somehow if they say, well, you hold that sex outside of marriage is always wrong, you're intolerant to people because I am tolerant because I let people believe whatever they want. Well, by saying that, I'm making a claim that everything's relative, or that the people can believe whatever they want, that truth doesn't exist. So I'm making my own claim that the reality is there is no truth. And I'm criticizing the other person for claiming there is an objective truth. And so it's this kind of vicious cycle and circle where I, as this subjectivist or relativist, am somehow above criticism for some reason. And so C.S. Lewis kind of calls them out on that and says that they're rejecting traditional values because they claim we'll reject them because they're objective. But at the same time, they're saying subjectivism is true, which is an objective statement. So he says that somehow they believe their own values can't be criticized or debunked, and they're wrong on this. And then in the chapter, C.S. Lewis is going to use an example. He's going to say that, we have, for example, soldiers who go out to war. And if you remember, this book is written during World War II, so this is very pressing on people's mind. So he says a soldier goes out and sacrifices his life for his country. This is these heroes, these patriots, and sacrifice their life. And we would see this self-sacrifice as being a good thing. This heroic act of patriotism is a good thing. We would say it's a value, that it's a virtue, that not everyone can do it, but we do praise those people who are willing to do that, to offer their life for the country. There's other things that we would consider that are always, can always be right or wrong. So rape, we would say, is always wrong. Racism, always wrong. Torture, always wrong. Domestic violence, always wrong. So that there are these values that people can universally agree are always wrong, and then things like sacrifice for one's country that are valuable and praiseworthy. And so, do these facts that there are certain things that people universally can agree upon, or right or wrong, witness to the existence of a universal objective moral truth? That's going to be C.S. Lewis's question. And then C.S. Lewis is he's going to start to use this word innovator several times, and he's going to be meaning like innovator, someone who kind of invents new ideas or kind of creates new ideas, and he's going to essentially be applying to the authors of the Green Book and other people who hold subjectivism. But he's going to say, if the innovator takes these examples, like sacrificing for your own country or rape or domestic violence, if he takes these examples and say that if you say that sacrifice for one country is a good thing, that's merely an irrational sentiment. Or if you say rape is wrong, that it's merely an irrational sentiment, then what basis is the innovator using to support or oppose these acts? Because the innovator is going to agree that rape is always wrong and that domestic violence is always wrong. So if he believes that, what foundation is he using to say they're wrong? Why do we not let someone just get away with rape and domestic violence if everything's subjective? And if everything is merely emotion and personal preference and sentiment, then why would we not let people do whatever they want, live however they want? And so C.S. Lewis is going to try to explore what arguments the innovator might use as to how we can say rape is always wrong, because the innovator would know everyone is going to agree with that statement. Rape is always wrong. Now, C.S. Lewis doesn't use the example of rape. I use it just because I think it's even more clear that people would agree it's right and wrong. C.S. Lewis is going to use sacrifice for one's country primarily as his example, but the point is that there are certain things that we can universally agree are right or wrong. And so what are the innovators going to use to be able to make this claim that there are things we all agree are right and wrong if you're going to reject objective value, traditional values? And so if we promote patriotism and sacrifice, how can the innovator promote this as being good? Similarly, if one were to say that, so C.S. Lewis is going to say that if we promote sacrifice for one's country as being good, someone might say, well, we believe it's good because it's honorable, it's an act of love, or it's an act of pride. Well, if we accept the subjectivist claims, if I'm a subjectivist, then we would have to say, well, these are all emotional arguments, and these can't be a reason for a country to promote military service. There needs to be something more foundational than just emotion, because honor and love and pride are emotions, and they're not really a strong, firm reason to give up your life for your country or for someone else necessarily. I mean, I could say, well, because I love my country or I love my family, I'm going to make a sacrifice of my life, but not everyone says that. There are some people who say, no, I don't want to sacrifice my life for my country or for my family. I think it is wrong to do that. Some people might say that. So how would a subjectivist argue that self-sacrifice is good, patriotism is good, if we want to try to eliminate emotion as being an argument, because that's just not a very solid argument. And so he says the innovator, how does that innovator argue that patriotism, this self-sacrifice, is good? He says, C.S. Lewis is going to say that one man could say, yes, I think it's good, I'm going to go sacrifice my life. But another man could say, no, I think selfishness is honorable and reasonable. I mean, if everything's subjective, why can't I say that selfishness is a good and that selfishness is honorable? How does the innovator make any statement to encourage men to serve their country? If we let people believe whatever they want about what is good and honorable, then you're never going to have people who are willing to go into military service. If we let people just say, yeah, selfishness is just as good as selflessness, or that selfishness is just as honorable as selflessness, how do we encourage people to serve their country? And so C.S. Lewis is trying to call out this problem with the subjectivist claim that people would agree sacrifice is a good, sacrifice for your country is a good, sacrifice for your family is a good, but how do we get people to see that if we are subjectivists? And so Lewis is going to say that, well, some subjectivists may turn to utilitarianism. This is a particular ethical philosophy that evaluates actions in the context of utility. So the word comes from the word utilitarian, comes from the word utility. Utility is a word that means like what is useful to the entire community. So you're going to look at the act itself and the consequences and outcomes, and you're going to look at it from this perspective of utility, of usefulness. There are many different types of utilitarianism if you really dive deep into this philosophy, and I'm not going to get into that. So there's things like preference utilitarianism and hedonistic utilitarianism. I'm not going to get into that. But generally speaking, what utilitarianism does is it's going to prescribe actions that maximize happiness and well-being for those affected. So it's going to look at outcomes, look at consequences, and try to say, how can we maximize the good and minimize the evil, or maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain for the people affected. And the problem with utilitarianism, though, is who defines what is good? Who defines what is a good outcome? Who defines what's happiness? Who defines, what is pleasure and what is pain? And who defines a lot of these characteristics the utilitarian might evaluate when we're looking at the outcomes of an action? Who defines, if we're looking at how can we maximize pleasure and minimize pain? Well, people define pleasure in different ways. So how do we define that? Or there's a lot of different opinions about what's good. And so utilitarianism has some problems. If it abandons all traditional values and just looks at this idea of good and pleasure and pain and suffering, that's a problem. Then we also look at, well, who will decide who will benefit? What if you have an action that's going to benefit some and harm others? And how do you decide that which group you're going to look at? How do you decide that we need to maximize benefit and minimize pain versus, maximize pain avoidance, even if it means less pleasure for people? And there's some goods in life. How do we even compare some of these things? How do we compare different goods? I mean, there's the good of health, there's the good of family, there's the good of friendship. So there's the good of, success in business. So there's different types of goods in life. How do we compare those? If we have an action that's going to maximize one of these goods in life, but it's going to affect how much good you can get in another area of life, how do we decide, if we're utilitarians, how are we going to decide how to balance this? So utilitarianism has problems with this approach to its worldview, and C.S. Lewis will try to briefly call attention to this, that if you're a subjectivist and you're going to use utilitarian ideas as your foundation for deciding what is good and what is bad, and deciding what you should or should not do in a situation, there's problems with that approach to the world and to ethics. Many people hold that today. There are many people who are utilitarians today, but there are some issues with this worldview. And so Lewis will argue, if we say self-sacrifice, so back to the example of being a patriot for your country. So Lewis says, if we say self-sacrifice is useful to some men, so using this utilitarian idea, it's useful to some men because it's going to save the lives of some men. If I go and fight a war and I die, but I've helped my country, it's useful and beneficial to my countrymen. But it's not good to me because I die. C.S. Lewis says, well, if self-sacrifice is useful to some, so, a utilitarian would say, because it is useful to some, it's good and should be promoted, then how do we still encourage each individual soldier to offer their life and to take this risk? So if I'm a man who they want to go to war, how do you encourage me to go to war by saying, well, if you go to war and make your sacrifice, look how many people of your community will benefit because you'll save their life, yet you'll die. It may be useful to the community, but it's not useful to me as an individual. So if you've abandoned all traditional values and you abandon any kind of objective moral truth, if you've abandoned objective values, then you can't approach me with the argument of it'll be honorable, it'll be praiseworthy, it's a good to sacrifice your life to your country. You can't say that because you're, as a subjectivist, claiming there are no objective values. Everything's subjective. So if I stand there and say, nah, I think selfishness is better, I think selfishness is a good. I don't want to go fight. So C.S. Lewis says, you have a problem if you're a subjectivist and use utilitarian ideas, because yes, it may be useful to the community, but how do you convince each individual person to see any type of value in this type of sacrifice if you're a subjectivist? And then C.S. Lewis also says that the subjectivist may say, well, it's good to preserve society. But again, C.S. Lewis says, well, but where do you get that idea from? If you're a subjectivist who's rejected all traditional value and you reject objective value, how do you convince individual men that it's a good thing to preserve society? How do you convince individual men to say that, yes, I know you might die, but it's good that you're preserving society? What if the individual person says, no, I think it's better for me to preserve my own life rather than to worry about society? And so C.S. Lewis says that a subjectivist has problems here. So the innovator cannot then say that the preservation of society or even the preservation of the human species is something we all ought to desire and promote. Because to say this would be to accept that there is a universal objective moral duty to preserve the species. And to do this would be to accept the existence of the Tao, because universal moral truth, this tradition that's existed for thousands of years, would hold that it is good to preserve life, it's good to preserve the species, it's good to preserve society, it's good to love your neighbor as yourself. But these are all foundational in the Tao. And so if a subjectivist is going to make the claim that these are actually goods, preserving society, preserving species, loving your neighbors yourself, to say those are good is now accepting the existence of the Tao. And so Lewis then will say, okay, well, let's say that we refute utilitarianism. We say, yeah, you really can't use that, because how do we define what's good, what's pleasurable? You know, how do you define what you should and shouldn't do if you've rejected all objective values? He says some people may then turn to an argument based on instinct. This is the next thing he says in the chapter, that people may base it on instinct. So Lewis says the innovator, again, who's a subjectivist, may claim, well, we have an instinctive urge to preserve our own species. But then Lewis says, well, but he's a subjectivist. So the innovator might add, but we have no instinctive urge to keep promises or to respect individual life. That is why scruples of justice and humanity, in fact, the Tao, can be properly swept away when they conflict with our real end, which is the preservation of the species, end quote. So this is a quote from chapter 2. So C.S. Lewis is saying that the innovator might argue, okay, well, the reason sacrificing for your country is good is because there is one instinctive urge that we all have, and that's to preserve our own species. And that one instinct is foundational, and that they would add, well, we don't have an instinctive urge to keep our promises, we don't have an instinctive urge to be honest, we don't have an instinctive urge to respect all life individually, we don't have an instinctive urge, you know, for some of these sexual taboos of Christianity. He's saying this is what the subjectivist would say, is like, these other things aren't instinctual urges. And so the Tao, we can just sweep it away if it conflicts with this one thing that is true, and that's the preservation of species. So this is C.S. Lewis kind of making, anticipating maybe an argument by the subjectivist using instinct. Well, we have this instinctive urge to preserve our species. That's the only instinct we should follow when it comes to saying anything is universally universally objective, is this instinct to preserve species. If anything conflicts with that, then we shouldn't do it. So if we have an instinct to be selfish and not be willing to sacrifice our life for our country, well, then that's not going to help preserve the species. So we should ignore that instinct, and we should be selfless and go be a soldier. Might be what the subjectivist says, or he's trying to say the subjectivist might claim that if that our, I guess, our view of the world and the view of what should or should not be done should be the central feature is the preservation of species. Preservation of species is the one thing, it's the one instinct that we all have, we can all agree upon, and that's the foundation. Nothing else is objectively true. Nothing else is universal besides this. Every other instinct that would conflict with this should be ignored, but this instinct should be followed, is essentially what I think Lewis is trying to say in this paragraph, in this quote. And then C.S. Lewis is going to say that the innovators will include, this is why in modernity, we're obligated to get rid of the sexual taboos in the past, because they're promoted based on this false notion of the Tao. Instead, our sexual instincts are good and we should act on them as long as they do not conflict with the preservation of the species. So C.S. Lewis is saying, and I'm imagining this is probably from his own experience, he's probably had these conversations where a subjectivist says that everything's subjective except we follow this instinct to preserve our species. Everything else is relative to that. And so sexual instincts, well, these are good because it's based on this instinct to preserve species. So these taboos that the Tao has, that this natural or this traditional moral law that we should not have sex outside of marriage and that we should not have sex with as many partners as possible, these are taboos. Sexual instincts are good, so let's just follow them. We should act on them. We should obey our instincts, whatever we, based on whatever we feel is good and right for us, as long as it does not conflict with the preservation of the species, is what the subjectivist will claim. And so C.S. Lewis is pointing out this extension of the argument based on instinct that I imagine he's heard from subjectivists or that he anticipates from the subjectivists. And Lewis will reply, well, but how do our instincts help us to find real values? How do we know which instincts to obey? So they're going to claim that the one instinct we should all follow is this instinct to preserve our species. But why should we follow that instinct? Why is that one instinct among all the others the one we know to be universally true and universally one we all have to follow? Why do we have to follow that? What if I don't want to do that? So C.S. Lewis is going to say, well, how do we know which instincts to obey? Where's the evidence that we should even obey these instincts? And so C.S. Lewis will point out that there are some instincts that conflict with each other. And how do we decide which to follow and which to ignore? So I have an instinct to eat healthy, but I have an instinct to eat numerous chocolate chip cookies for dinner. How do I know which instinct to follow? Or we may have an instinct to work hard and be successful, to do really well in life, but at the same time have an instinct where I'm inclined to laziness. I enjoy, sitting around and not doing anything at the same time. What if we have these two different instincts and they conflict? How do we know which instinct to follow? Or I have an instinct to be kind, but I also have an instinct to hit someone when I'm angry. How do you know which instinct to follow? So a lot of times these instincts conflict with each other. How do we make a claim that one of these instincts, the instinct to preserve our species, is the one that is always true and good and that we should always follow? How do we know that? And then if we're going to say that as long as we act to preserve the species, we can follow the other instincts however we want, is that true? Can I really just eat chocolate chip cookies for every meal all the time because that's my instinct? And Lewis says that if they claim that we should obey our instincts because they make us happy, how can this be the case with a soldier who's risking his life? So if the innovator says, well, the instinct to preserve our species is the one that we have to act upon, we can't do anything to conflict with that, and then every other instinct should be followed as long as it makes us happy. Well, but how can a soldier who's risking his life in war be happy about that exactly? There may be some pride and honor in this, but how is it going to make him feel happy, particularly? So how do we encourage our men to go be soldiers if they continue to have this instinct of selfishness, this instinct to no, I don't want to sacrifice my life for others? How do you encourage men to be willing to go be heroes? And so he says, moreover, if the innovators claim that we should see a soldier's self-sacrifice as good because it is in accord with our instinct to preserve our species, again, why should we obey even this instinct to preserve our species? who says that that's something we should do? I mean, what if someone says, well, okay, I don't want to preserve our species. Let's just let all human beings get wiped off the planet. So what? You know, if everything's subjective, where is our evidence that we should act to preserve our species? Why is that something that must be obeyed by everyone if the subjectivist is going to claim this? So C.S. Lewis is trying to, I think, draw out these kind of problems with the subjectivist argument. He articulates it very well, but he articulates it in a very, I think, challenging and difficult way. So hopefully me helping, hopefully what I'm doing is basically trying to express what he's saying in my own words, and hopefully this is helpful to you, although I'm not sure that I'm as eloquent. I'm definitely not as eloquent as he is, but hopefully I'm at least somewhat clear on the points I'm trying to make. And so C.S. Lewis will continue, you know, we may have this instinct to act a certain way, but how do we go from something being an instinct that's within us to being something that we ought to obey? So, okay, let's say that we recognize there is this instinct to preserve our species. How do we know it's an instinct that we ought to obey? What if we have, you know, again, if we have this instinct, if they're going to tell us, subjectivists tell us that this notion of using our instinct is how we can guide our actions, how do we know that an instinct is something that should be obeyed? And then Lewis will say, you know, subjectivists claim that we obey our instincts because our instincts direct us to know what is good. This is a flawed notion. He says that, you know, I guess for one, our instincts do not necessarily direct us to know what is truly good. And we'll come to this here in a minute, but there are things that are truly good and things that are apparently good. And the things that are apparently good are ones that appear good, but they're actually not good for us. They do not help us flourish. And so if someone does make this claim, we should obey our instincts because they direct us to the good. This is definitely flawed, and we should call them out on it. Is what do you mean by good, and how do we know our instincts always direct us to this? Lewis says that when a subjectivist says that we should act in order to preserve our species, such as a soldier being willing to sacrifice himself for the country, he says this is an instinct. It's based on loving your neighbor as yourself and of seeing the value of protecting the lives of others. And this is a long-standing universal value. It's not merely sentiment. It's not merely Christian. Confucius, the Stoics, the Jews, the Christians, among others, all held this same idea, that you should love your neighbor as yourself, and there's a value in protecting the lives of others. There's a value in sacrifice. There's a value in selflessness. And it's this that this idea of self-sacrifice for your country is grounded on. And so C.S. Lewis says what the subjectivist is doing ultimately, if we get boiled down to the foundation of what's happening here, C.S. Lewis says the subjectivist is simply taking this universal objective value that has been held for centuries, for thousands of years even at that. It's already been held that self-sacrifice is good. So the subjectivist is taking what we already know to be objectively true and just saying, well, this is an instinct. This is really just based on an instinct to be selfless. But ultimately, those values the subjectivist holds to be worthy and to be good are derived from the Tao. They're derived from the natural moral law, the subjective universal law that's been around for thousands of years. Now, the subjectivist is searching for a different explanation because he wants to dismiss the Tao. But ultimately, when it boils down to it, the only foundation for self-sacrifice for your country is this long-standing universal objective value of loving your neighbors yourself and the value of protecting the lives of others. And so C.S. Lewis in chapter 2 is going to talk again about the Tao. And the Tao is the natural moral law, also known as traditional morality. C.S. Lewis says that some cultures may call it first platitudes. Some people may call it first principles of practical reason. Practical reason is the way that our intellect governs our actions. So the Tao is based on these first principles, these universal principles of how to act. And so these are all equivalent in C.S. Lewis's mind. The Tao and then these four terms are all equivalent. There's this traditional morality, this natural moral law that's universal, that's objective. And so C.S. Lewis will say, if you reject the Tao, you reject all objective moral truth. So you can't pick and choose. You can't say that I believe this one particular objective value is true, but I reject the others. This is kind of an all or nothing. And C.S. Lewis says that if you reject the Tao, you lose an essential foundation for life and society. And this rejection will be a destructive act. It's going to be destructive. If the society has no moral foundation, no moral grounding, it'll fall apart. It'll be destroyed. And so he says that the Tao, the natural moral law, exists because of the type of creatures that we are. The Tao is the way to human happiness and flourishing. So, another way of kind of understanding what the natural moral law is, the Tao, it exists because of how. Now, one way to talk to people who aren't Christian would say because of the type of creatures that we are. But as Christians, we would say that it's because of who the type of creature that God made us to be. That God made us in a particular way for a particular purpose, to become saints, to become holy. And the natural moral law is based on the creatures the type of creature he created us to be. But C.S. Lewis is not going to refer to God and any type of particular Christian teaching, because he's speaking to an audience who is not simply Christian. There's a lot of different people in his audience. And so he wants to show this is not just a Christian thing, a Christian idea. And so to kind of leave specifics of Christianity out of it, you would say, because the type of creatures that we are, there are certain actions that we should or should not do in order to flourish. So for example, this was not given by C.S. Lewis, but I'll just use it. It was given by a Catholic named Frank Sheed in another book called The Map of Life. But he talks about how, imagine you have a facial razor, a razor that's used to shave men's beards. And you take that same razor and you try to carve wood with it. What's going to happen to this facial razor? It's going to be destroyed because you're not using the razor for what it was intended to be used for. The purpose of the razor is to shave a beard on a face. It's not to carve wood. Wood is the wrong type of surface to use it on. And after just a few attempts, that razor blade is going to be destroyed because it's not meant to hold up to that type of activity. And so we would say that the facial razor was made with a particular purpose, with a particular goal. In order to achieve the goal of what the razor was made for, you have to use the razor properly on a man's beard to shave his face. And same thing with humans, that we were made in a particular way. We're a particular type of creatures who achieve happiness and flourishing if we act and behave in certain ways that are proper to the type of creatures that we are. And this is the grounding of the natural moral law. It tells us the behaviors that are proper to us as human beings that will help us to flourish, and that there are certain behaviors that will be contrary to that will be destructive, that will not help us flourish, they'll destroy us. Another example would be if you take a train engine. I use this often in some of my other talks, but if you take a train engine and you put it on a highway, what's going to happen? It's not going to be able to function. It'll just sit there. It won't be able to achieve its goal. It will never be able to get to its destination because the train engine was not made to work on a highway. It's made to work on train tracks. Some people may see the train tracks as being oppressive or limiting, but the train tracks help the train function and achieve its goal because it can't function on the highway. And the same thing with us. The natural moral law is objective universal truths that teach us about who we are. And these moral truths tell us there are certain things we should do and certain things we should never do. And it's because we want to achieve our purpose, our goal. We want to flourish. And the only way to do that is to do things proper to who we are. If a boy, imagine a human being, a boy, jumps off a roof because he wants to fly like a bird. Will he fly? No, he's going to fall to the ground because he's not a bird. He doesn't have wings. We were not created, we're not the type of creatures who are able to fly on our own. And so it's just the fact of who we are. We can't deny that. We can't become something that we're not. Now, technology has helped with that. So technology could help someone be able to fly off a roof. But the type of creatures that we are on our own, our human nature is such. We're not the type of creatures who can fly without some type of technological assistance. And so the natural moral law, again, is related to that. It shows us the type of things we should and should not do because of who we are. So C.S. Lewis is saying these exist. There are moral truths that exist because of who we are. We cannot deny this. We cannot say that certain things like jumping off a roof are okay if someone just feels the need to do it. If a boy thinks it might be fun and pleasurable to jump off a roof, we don't say, okay, that's good to do. We have to say, no, that'd be wrong because it's the type of creature you are. You will harm yourself, potentially even die. And so that's kind of the argument of, or that's kind of the understanding of the natural moral law in some analogous ways. And so the Tao, the natural moral law, directs us to what is good for us as the specific type of creatures that we are. And good here refers to those things that bring about our perfection and flourishing. The natural moral law is universal and objective. It can be known by reason. And then Lewis, as I mentioned earlier, he's going to collect many of these moral truths that are held by people from diverse backgrounds and put them in the appendix of the book. So you can look there to find views that we agree on. If you're Christian or Hindu or Confucian or Jewish, there's a lot of different views where we agree because these are all universal objective values. And that's his point. So another person to kind of keep in mind related to this is Thomas Aquinas. So he's a Catholic theologian. And so he has prolific writings, but in some of his writings, he talks about the natural moral law. And so Aquinas would say that every choice we make as human beings is done in the pursuit of a good. So every action that we do is pursuing a good. However, Aquinas points out that we have to make a distinction. There are apparent goods, and then there are things that are truly good. Apparent goods are illusory goods. And sometimes we fall prey to following apparent goods, these illusory goods. Sometimes we will make decisions to act for something that we think is good, but it's merely apparently good. It's not truly good. And so these apparent goods are not good. They're destructive. And so we have to make a distinction. So we always act for something that's good to us, but it doesn't mean it's truly good and proper to our flourishing. So I'll give you an example. So a person using heroin, he may pursue it because of the good of the pleasure he feels when he gets a high. But a true good for us as human beings is the good of health. And using heroin is destructive of this good. So the natural moral law helps us to know, using our reason, that health and life are goods, and these things should be pursued. Actions that are intentionally destructive of these goods are contrary to the moral law and should be avoided. So the natural moral law would say health and life are good. These goods should be pursued. If we're fooled to think that heroin is a good because of this pleasure we get from a high, we need to evaluate that in the context of the good of life and health. And because we would then see that heroin is destructive of our health, then we would know this is only an apparent good. It should be avoided. It's not good to do in actuality. But a subjectivist rejects the Tao. And so to be true to this subjectivist philosophy, he would have to say, if the person feels the heroin is good, then he should do it. There's no objective moral truth. We should not judge drug use as wrong. Let people do what they want, live how they want. It's all a matter of personal preference and opinion if you say heroin is wrong. This is what a subjectivist would have to do if he's being consistent with his philosophy. Even though if we all step back and in an unbiased way evaluate the situation, I think we can all recognize that heroin is bad. Why? Because there is this natural moral law within our hearts that we know to be true because the type of creatures that we are, that health and life are good, and that heroin is destructive of this, and that it's objectively not a good. Heroin is destructive to the person, to his family, to society, and we can all see that. But a subjectivist, if he's being consistent with his philosophy, has no basis for a system of value to be able to say that one should not use heroin. He has no basis to say that we should respect life and health as good, objectively. He has no basis to say that we should not be selfish. So if someone says, oh, you shouldn't use heroin because it's going to destroy your family, you're selfish. Well, the subjectivist has no basis to say that a person shouldn't be selfish. If I hold selfishness to be good, if I am a subjectivist who's consistent, I should be able to say, well, okay, I can't argue with you there. If you think being selfish is good, then go ahead, take heroin, destroy your family, or subjectivists can't say that we should always care how our actions affect others. And as subjectivist, if he's being consistent, cannot say that we should care about how our affections affect others. Why should we? If I'm consistent as a subjectivist, then I should be able to say, well, I can live and do what I want. I don't care about other people. I don't care about my family. I don't care about anyone but myself. How is that not an acceptable view if I'm a subjectivist? So C.S. Lewis is going to show that if we step back, we can see that this subjectivist viewpoint is incredibly flawed and it's incredibly destructive. And ultimately what subjectivists are doing, because everyone can look around and say, yeah, heroin is bad, heroin is wrong, it's destructive, we shouldn't do it, we should discourage it. Everyone can see that. So if a subjectivist is going to make the claim that heroin is wrong and that it shouldn't be done, they're ultimately grounding themselves in the Tao because they have no other way to have a basis for this system of values. So the Tao, the natural moral law, so moving on a little bit, in chapter 2, C.S. Lewis is going to point out that the Tao, the natural moral law, it never changes. It doesn't change. So something that was always wrong 2,000 years ago is always wrong today, according to the natural moral law, but it can develop, which means that we can grow in our understanding of it. We can, as we encounter advancements in human technology, then we'll have to apply the natural moral law in different circumstances. But it's never going to change, but it could develop. And so C.S. Lewis will point that out. And C.S. Lewis will also point out that it's also possible for some cultures to ignore or dismiss elements of the natural moral law. So just because we say there is a natural moral law that's universal and objective, it doesn't mean that every single culture is going to get every aspect of it always right, or that cultures are going to always apply the natural moral law correctly. Some people may apply it incorrectly. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So for example, a culture may hold marriage as a good, which is according to the natural moral law, but they may at the same time see nothing wrong with sex outside of marriage. Well, that's a wrong application of the natural moral law, because if you truly understand marriage as a good and understand why marriage is a good, then you would reject out sex outside of marriage. Sex outside of marriage, the objection to that is based on understanding why marriage is a good. But cultures can apply the natural moral law incorrectly. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, is C.S. Lewis's point. Another example, a culture may hold that murder, the intentional killing of an innocent life, is always wrong. That same culture may practice cannibalism. But C.S. Lewis will say, well, this is a misapplication and a misunderstanding, because oftentimes this is a misunderstanding of the natural moral law, because oftentimes with these cultures, they would see the neighboring tribes as being less than human. So they saw cannibalism not as murder, but as an action committed against an inferior creature, an inferior being. So some of these cultures just misunderstood human beings and what human nature was. And so it wasn't that they saw cannibalism as being murder. Now, cannibalism is still wrong, but the cultures that practice this often did not fully understand human beings and the world in a correct way. So that doesn't mean that because they did this, that there was no universal objective moral law that should be applied to them. If someone went and explained to this culture, no, this neighboring tribe over here, they're just as human as you are, that's also equivalent to murder, then they would have to act accordingly and not murder them. So, kind of what I'm trying to get to is that just because if we look back in the past, cultures have not always seen all elements of the natural moral law, or it's because they haven't been faithful to the natural moral law, does not mean it doesn't exist. And then chapter 2 ends with this quote, "Let us regard all ideas of what we ought to do simply as interesting psychological survival. Let us step right out of all that and start doing what we like. Let us decide for ourselves what man is to be and make him into that, not on any ground of imagined value, but because we want him to be such. Having mastered our environment, let us now master ourselves and choose our own destiny." End quote. So C.S. Lewis is saying, well, if we're going to let the subjectivists have their way, if we're going to promote the Green Book and the philosophy it's promoting of subjectivism, then this is what we would have to say. Well, let's just start doing what we like. This idea that there's anything that we ought to do is just for survival. There's nothing true about it. So let's just all decide for ourselves who man is and what we want to do. Live however you want, become whoever you want. It doesn't matter. Now that we've mastered our environment, we can use technology to do whatever we want, to become whomever we want. And so, if the subjectivists succeed, or for those who agree with subjectivism, Lewis says, so if you reject the Tao, this notion of objective morality and objective truth, then the result is that we encourage people to simply do what they like. And as a result, people will invent their own values, they'll invent their own morals, they'll claim that they don't have to do what anyone else says. No one can define good or bad. Essentially, man will decide what man is and who he should be. There are no givens. The idea that we were created for a specific goal or for a specific purpose is rejected. We can become whomever we want to be. And I think just, in our current times and circumstances, we can see this happening all around us. Students who, you can see students, this idea of, a lot of the people, students and college students, but even adults now, just everyone promoting this idea of being, quote, tolerant, of people's ideas. But then at the same time, if a Christian promotes an objective moral truth, then we become all of a sudden intolerant. It's this idea of subjectivism at work, but also this idea of becoming whoever you want to be. Well, I want to become a cat, and so if someone gets surgery to reshape their ears to make them look like a cat, and to reshape their eyes to be very narrow like a cat's eyes. Or if someone says that I think being paralyzed is a good thing, there's this disorder that exists where people have this just idea within themselves that they want to be paralyzed, even though they're not. So it's this disorder that people talk about, this body identity disorder type thing. So a subjectivist would have to say, well, if they feel like they're paralyzed, why don't we just let them have what they want? We have technology to do it, surgery to do it. But I think a lot of us would say, whoa, wait a minute. That's so destructive of that human being. His body is functioning, it's good. Why would we take a person who we call like able-bodied, who's able to walk on 2 feet and able to function well, and then allow them to have some type of surgery where it severs their spinal cord so they become paralyzed? How is that even okay? But if we're going to be consistent with the subjectivist idea that people should be able to become whomever they want to be, then what's the argument for saying that's something that's wrong? That destroying the human body like that's wrong? And then we see that playing out too with the notion of gender, that I'm born a biological sex of either having XX chromosome being female or an XY chromosome being male, but that people are saying I'm not tied to my biology. I can become whomever I want to be, however I feel, whatever my emotions tell me about myself. This is really what's true and what's good about who I am. And the reality is not based on my biology. I'm not tied to that. I can become whoever I want to be. And now that we have technology to do it, I'm going to utilize this technology to become whomever I want to be. And no one can tell me that this is good or bad or right or wrong. I define my own values. So we see this really coming to play in this area. And I'm not trying to be critical of people who struggle with gender identity and things like that, because it is definitely this very painful, psychological distress that these people go through and that they're dealing with, and they need our help. But the culture is tending to approach it, it seems, with more of this attitude kind of based on this subjectivist grounding that there is no right and wrong. People can become whomever they want, and that's a problem. But I think we can even extend this to something even more kind of day to day. How many times do we hear people telling children or high school students or college students, go be whoever you want to be, define life however you want to be. But I think this is the wrong approach, because if you think about it, each of us is born with certain gifts and talents. I am a introverted type person. I am not someone who is really outgoing and bubbly and charming and charismatic. So if I had a goal of being maybe kind of like a sales representative, for example, that would not be a good job for me. I may, it's something that maybe I see that something as being a great career to do, but there is something about who I am, type of creature that I am, that my personality, my skills and talents would not be best utilized in that career of being a salesperson. Some of our drug reps or car salesmen, I mean, sometimes I get a little jealous because they can just talk to anybody. They're very personal, outgoing, they're so friendly. I kind of wish I had some of those characteristics sometimes, but I don't. So if as a college student, that was something that I really wanted to be, for someone to tell me, oh yeah, go do whatever you want, be whoever you want to be, that would actually have been bad advice. And this is just kind of a small example. And I think we can extend that onto a larger scale, that all of us have certain characteristics and traits and skills and talents that we should be encouraging people to find out what these are and to maximize those things, to utilize those things. Take advantage of the fact that there are certain things that I'm good at and I'm skilled at. We need to go and look at our future with those things in mind. And then on a more transcendental scale, look at the fact that we actually are created by God. Even though C.S. Lewis is not going to make this argument because he doesn't want to deter his audience from listening. As Christians, as I think most of you listening are, God created us. And why? He created us for purpose. He created us out of love, for love. He wants us to love him. He wants us to be holy. He wants us to be saints in heaven. And there should never be a moment of our life that we're not living with that in mind. We are created with a purpose and for a reason and for a goal, to be saints, to be holy. And so we have to look at our life in that way, and every single day be conforming our life to that goal, committing our life, doing all of our actions with that in mind. There is objective truth. There is this transcendent reality that we should be striving for and striving towards. The subjectivist worldview, though, destroys that. And I think that's why C.S. Lewis sees that as incredibly destructive. And so now that he's drawn this out in chapter 2 to really try to argue against subjectivism, and then at the end he presents one of the problems with it, one of the big problems with it, this idea that we just tell people, go be whoever you want to be. Now in chapter 3, he's going to continue to show us why this subjectivist mentality is so destructive. And he's going to talk more about the problem of subjectivism. So I'm going to conclude with that. Hopefully this was helpful. If you, have questions, please post those. And and then be on the lookout for the Zoom discussion after chapter 3. All right. Oh, that lighting's awful. Sorry about that. All right, well, take care.